One of the most common arguments made over here and in other places in Europe as well is that what Israel is doing is just creating more terrorists in the long run, with the bombing and the ground campaign as well. Recently, I read a book, a very good book on Japan before and after World War II, and it described the scene that General MacArthur met when he left Japan in 1950 or 51, whenever it was, that there were thousands of Japanese lined up and singing songs, singing odes to him essentially, and throwing flowers at him and so forth. And I thought to myself, what an incredible way to treat the general who is at least symbolically responsible for dropping 2 nuclear bombs on your country. And if it were true that the creation of more hatred was an inevitable result of a massive military campaign, why haven't we been dealing with Japanese terrorists for the past 70 years? As a counterpoint to this argument, but I'm curious, how do you think about the trade-off between creating more hatred in the long run and the current military campaign?
I think it infantilizes Palestinians. I think that the argument is essentially that they are utterly reactive, just emotional people, and when they suffer, they lash out. Why? Because if I was suffering, so goes the inherent logic and then just in this argument, wouldn't I lash out? Wouldn't I feel rage? If you were Hollywood, yeah, but in reality, that's not how this works. There's a tremendous amount of Palestinian anger at Hamas. There's also a tremendous amount in the very same polls that tells us this Palestinian anger. 70% of Palestinians don't want Hamas to be left standing at the end of this war in Gaza right now. Also, the vast majority of Palestinians are proud of October 7. Also, huge numbers of Palestinians buy into the fundamental religious narrative Hamas sells them, which is that their story isn't one of weakness and dispossession. Their story is one of being the vanguard of a grand Islamic resurgence from 400 years of weakness. All of these ideas and experiences and emotions and stories and are all the lens, layered on top of each other, are the lens through which Palestinians are seeing their current predicament and situation and understanding their suffering in Gaza. It isn't a situation where, oh my God, the Israelis are violent, now we must kill them. The problem, one of the great strategic problems Palestinians face is that their politics, their ideological elites, principally, but not only Hamas, have convinced the Israelis, not today, for 30 years, that every Israeli withdrawal will end in rivers of blood. And that comes from the Second Intifada, where the height of the peace process was shattered by 140 suicide bombings, right? If you had in America today, I'm sorry, I'm going to step on people's feelings and get canceled, but what the heck? A Mexican immigrant walks into a non-alcoholic bar in St. Louis, Missouri. We have non-alcoholic bars. Those are bars for teenagers. And they detonate a shrapnel bomb that kills 24 kids. And then they explain it in a video in which they say, Trump imprisoned children and then lost the children. But, Democrats don't get off the hook because Obama, deported more people than the Republican administration before or after. And Biden made everything worse. And I am going to make you, America, see this pain of tens of millions of people, and then, boom, the bomb goes off. What I would be fascinated to know in that kind of situation is not how Donald Trump's tweet looks, right? The sort of anti-immigrant conservative it's very easy for them to respond, right? It's basically an I told you so. What's the progressive response to a moment like that, to that scale of violence coming from somebody who's video explaining their action, mass murder of children, whose video explaining the mass murder you agree with? What do you do then? And I suspect that at first some progressives would be saying things like, this is how bad it is. We should. This person did something horrifying. We condemn it, right? But shows us how terrible the situation is. What happens a week later when there's another one? What is progressive Twitter look like? What happens a week after that when there are 3 more, or a month after that when there are 13? What happens over 3 years when there are 140 of those bombings? I submit to you there's a moment where progressive politics can no longer talk about immigration and doesn't want to. And I submit to you that there simply won't be a policy, and most progressives will support a big giant wall that's electrified. The Israeli left hasn't won an election since the Second Intifada. And it hasn't won an election since the Second Intifada because to this day Israelis don't know what the Second Intifada was about. The peace process was launched after the Israeli experience of the First Intifada, where there's this occupation for 20 years by 1987. And then the First Intifada breaks out, and half of Israeli society understands that as a moral argument toward us. But by 2000, when the Second Intifada begins, all the soldiers are out of the cities, and the 2 leaders are in Camp David negotiating a shared sovereignty on the Temple Mount. To this day, Israelis believe, genuinely, left-wing Israelis who want a Palestinian state, that because of the ideological narratives that animate the Palestinian national movement, chiefly, but not only the Islamist one, they cannot reciprocate our withdrawals with peace. That's the great problem Palestinians face. They have serious, deep religious and political ideas and understandings and lenses through which they interpret their reality. And if the entirety of the sort of Western liberal debate about them, instead of talking about this shattering folly, and instead of talking about how the Israeli mind responds to what Palestinian actions born of what's happening in the Palestinian mind, everybody is shrunk down to a cartoon that has no theory of mind at all. And we're all just a bunch of children responding emotionally. That was a long way of saying I reject the premise, and I reject it in the name of Palestinian dignity,